Hi, everybody. Welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graben. My guest today is Denis Crawford. He's author of the book titled The Life and Teams of Johnny F. Bassett, Maverick Entrepreneur of North American Sports. So Denis holds a PhD in American Studies. He teaches at Youngstown State University, and he's managing editor for the Coffin Corner, the official magazine of the Professional Football Researchers Association. So before I tell you a little bit more about Denis, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me, Mark. It's a pleasure to appear on your show.
Well, it's great to have you here. And as I've disclosed in some other episodes, occasionally I've had opportunity to interview someone I've known for a long time, whether it's a friend from high school or somebody with a college connection. But people watching on YouTube might not realize or might not guess the connection because we're roughly the same age. Denis is technically my uncle because my dad's sister, who he'd married, was in kindergarten when I was born. So not to make it a family history lesson, I don't call them aunt and uncle, but
that's okay. Although I think legally I am. So
legally, not just technically.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Uncle Denis, welcome to the podcast. It's probably, no offense, the only time I've called you Uncle Denis so directly, right?
And that's okay. It will be the only time I ever expected it.
Okay. Is that, it's probably not a mistake to just Denis.
Yes.
I get like that. Anyway, Uncle Denis doesn't sound right. Just Denis doesn't sound right. I'm going to quit stammering through that. So, we'll talk about your book and we're going to talk about mistakes and all sorts of realms. Before we talk about your favorite mistake, Denis, in a nutshell, real quick, I mean, fascinating man and career and life. In a nutshell, who was Johnny Bassett? Why write a book about him and his life and his career?
Well, I started to write about him because I was going to originally write a book about the Tampa Bay Bandits, his team in the United States Football League. And as I began to do the research of that, a lot of memories started firing off in my head because I had grown up in Tampa Bay during the 70s and 80s during the height of what was known as the Bandit Ball era. And I just became enamored with his showmanship. I came to learn that he was called a Canadian P.T. Barnum. Although I know sometimes Barnum can have a bad reputation, he was a great showman, and so was Bassett. He had fun creating sporting spectacles, and he took great pains to make sure that the fan experience, and they didn't even know the term fan experience at the time, but he took great pains to make sure the fan experience at any of his sporting events was prime. He had a gift for knowing what the common man wanted. And of course, that came with a lot of experience because, as I'm sure we'll talk about later, he was not exactly a common man. He was born into a very wealthy and powerful family in Canada, but his work in sports led to him losing most of that fortune. And so he did a very good job of learning from those losses and creating what I considered to be a sporting utopia in the Tampa Bay area for just the briefest of times.
Yeah. I mean, he's, you mentioned Barnum. There's a difference between showman and Shyster. Johnny Bassett was certainly not a shyster. He was a showman who was, it sounded like, trying to do the right things by his community, his fans, his players, his organizations.
Yes. He had a belief that the man who paid the ticket had the right to the best experience possible. And so when he would go in and talk to his marketing team and was told, we can't do that, it's too expensive, his argument was it would be too expensive not to. I need to know the guy who put the quarter out for the ticket deserves more consideration than the guy who's putting thousands of dollars out, because the guy who's putting out the quarter is really scratching to put that money in my wallet. And so he wanted to make sure the person who had the lowest price ticket had just as much fun as the one who paid for the premium seats.
Yeah. So there's a lot of great business lessons, and he was doing a lot of innovative entrepreneurial things. So again, the title of the book is The Life and Teams of Johnny F. Bassett, Denis Crawford, the author and our guest today. So before we come back and talk more about Johnny Bassett, Denis, as we always ask everybody here, what would you say is your favorite mistake?
That's such a wonderful name for a show and for a concept. It's I don't know if it's favorite, but it's probably the most defining of my life. And that is that, as I said, I grew up in the Tampa Bay area in the 70s and 80s and into the early 90s. And I was enamored with getting into sports journalism, sports broadcasting. When I was at St. Petersburg Junior College, I had an internship at the local ABC affiliate. And then as an undergraduate at Florida State, I got an internship with a Tampa-based all sports radio station. And so I learned, but in my arrogance and ignorance, I guess those go hand in hand when you're in your late teens and early 20s, I didn't make those opportunities work for me. Because I felt I'm going to be a broadcaster. I'm going to be the one calling play-by-play, or I'm going to be the one holding interview sessions. I don't need to worry about editing. I don't have to worry about tape archives. And so what happened was, because I wasn't respectful enough of the craft at the time, other interns ended up having much better audition tapes than I did, and ended up being able to answer questions much more intelligently during job interviews than I could have. And so at the time, I regretted it. I guess I still regret it a little bit, but you know how life works. Things just kind of happen then after that, and you move on. And what I discovered was the lesson I learned from those mistakes was never, ever to look an opportunity. The old expression, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Never just assume the opportunity will lead to something unless you respect it enough to put all of your effort into it. And I think I have successfully done that in the years since. When an opportunity came to go and get a better education, get advanced degrees, I took advantage of that. I went back and got a master's in organizational communication. And one of the methods that I learned was the historical method. And then I realized, I really like history. So I started to use that historical method to then start doing more work in sports. And what I found is, while it was embarrassing in the moment, I don't think I could have accomplished the level of sports-related research and hopefully entertaining books that I've created if I had actually become just another local sports guy on your AM dial.
Did you have a role model of an announcer who you would have emulated or wanted to be? Like somebody calling games nowadays, it would be, let's say, the Tampa Rays on the local station, or it would have been different?
Well, at my during my time, the gold standard, and this was more national than local, the gold standard was Pat Summerall.
Yeah.
I just loved his style. He was very Spartan in what he said. And I also think I liked him because my football team at the time, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, were so bad, and Pat Summerall only called the best games that, the one time maybe he would call a Buccaneer game, I was just right there because it was so exciting to realize, Pat Summerall actually knows my team exists. But it was just that style and the way he was straight man to John Madden. To mix my sporting metaphors, he was a great point guard. He could set it up, but then let Madden go the rest of the way.
Or they almost say, like, a well refereed basketball game, you barely notice the refs. Is the same true with a really good play-by-play person?
I do think so. at the risk of sounding like the get off my lawn man, I do think that current announcers just talk too much.
Mm-hmm.
They talk over the ambient noise of the game. They talk over the sounds of the crowd. They forget the fact that I am watching the game, so I see what they're describing.
Yeah.
I don't need to know that somebody's at the 5, the 10, the 15, the 20, and he cuts left because I can see that part. That was the beauty of Summerall. It would be, I guess, if we were using modern football players, Tom Brady, Rob Gronkowski, touchdown. He didn't have to say, Tom Brady drops back, surveys the field, rolls to his right, he throws it downfield. There's Gronkowski. In 4 words, he described everything for you.
Yeah. So back to your internships. I mean, when did you have this recognition of the mistake? Was it kind of in immediate aftermath of, let's say, not getting positions that others were interviewing for? Did it reveal itself a little bit later when you had time to mature, reflect, and
because you've got pride, maybe an overabundance of pride. I realized that I had made a mistake, but I don't think I truly appreciated the opportunity that I had missed until a few years later. Mm-hmm. But fortunately, by the time I really sat down and did some self-reflection about it, I had a master's degree. I had a solid job in banking. I met someone and have had a wonderful life together. So it's one of those things. It's like in the moment it was embarrassing. A couple of years later, it was still a little embarrassing. But then realizing that my life doesn't take the turns it does if I had not made that mistake. So I think most of the time there is some good from our mistakes.
Yeah. Well, and that is often true, or as you've talked about, the learning that comes from it, recognizing the opportunity to not look that gift horse in the mouth the next time a different gift horse comes along, to seize a different opportunity, and, as you were saying, put your all into it. So I think I appreciate that reflection. I had a chance to interview, not to get too sidetracked on this, but Daniel Pink, who wrote a book called The Power of Regret. And it sounds, we were talking a little bit, mistakes often lead to regret. It sounds like your situation, your mistakes didn't lead to a huge amount of regret.
No, I think it's one size does not necessarily fit all. Other people who blew their opportunities can spiral, but I also feel like I was fortunate. I don't know why I was given more than 1 or 2 opportunities, but or maybe that's it. You're just given a lot of opportunities, but you have to get better at recognizing them. But I don't have any regrets over that now because, like I said, of the way my life turned out.
Yeah. So let's talk more about the life and teams of Johnny F. Bassett. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, and you share really interesting stories in the book of some mistakes, and I say that, I guess with the recognition that I think, as you were saying, Bassett was probably the most successful owner in each of the failed leagues he was a part of. Is that fair to say?
Yes, he always had that. Well, he always had that joke in the USFL when the USFL came along, that when he was in the WFL, the World Football League, he was the richest owner. But in the United States Football League, he was the poorest because he had lost most of his fortune in his first few startups. And I guess another thing I really do like about Bassett and respect about him is I found him a little bit of a kindred spirit. I can be a little bit of a showman at times. I love a good spectacle. But he was very naive in the opportunities he had to establish a football team in the World Football League and to establish a hockey team in the World Hockey Association. I think he felt that as long as he could write checks, everything would work. As long as his organizations were first class, everything would be fine. And that's actually incredibly naive, because when it comes to a professional sports league, you literally only are as strong as your weakest franchise. And so what happened in the World Football League is his Memphis team was incredibly well stocked with talent. It was well funded. Every player I interviewed for that book said the training table, the training camp, the road travel was on par with the NFL.
Yeah.
Well, that was one island in a sea of misery. The other owners in the World Football League were not very well vetted by either Bassett or by the commissioner of the league. You know, they wrote those initial checks for their down payment, but then they didn't have the funds to actually put a sporting endeavor in place. And so I think that was something Bassett didn't truly appreciate until he lost his shirt and had to recover it when he went, going from the 70s into the 80s.
Yeah. And he was in some really tough competitive situations. The first team up in Toronto in the WHA, the hockey league that was competing against the NHL, and some teams ended up absorbed into the NHL. But the Toronto Toros were competing against the NHL Maple Leafs. They had the challenge of sharing an arena with the NHL owner who didn't really want to give them a good deal. And there was one mistake you write about in the book where you described it as, I don't know if this was his worst mistake, but you described it as the worst mistake an owner can make.
Yes, he undercuts his head coach. Bob Bond was the head coach of the Maple Leafs during their last year in Toronto, and it was a veteran team, and Bassett's younger than some of the players on the team. He's only in his early 30s at the time, so some of his players, like Frank Mahovlich, are 2 years older than he is at this point, and they were struggling on ice. They were in a losing streak. They lost a heartbreaking game, I believe, in Houston. And when they travel to Phoenix for their next game, some of the veteran players don't show up on time. There's a curfew on road trips and the players don't show up on time. So the head coach fines them. And the players go to Bassett to complain. And Bassett says the fines are vacant. You don't have to pay him anymore. And that's a really bad decision to make, because that just took all the authority of your coach away. And even the coach said that Bassett needs to be more concerned with being a boss and not everybody's buddy, because we have the term today, fanboy. Bassett was a bit of a fanboy at that time, and it really hurt him, it hurt his coach, and it ultimately hurt the team.
Well, I think there's a great kind of broader transferable leadership lesson there for an organization. If employees are doing an end around to you, don't undermine, don't undercut one of the leaders who is in that chain, that leadership chain.
Yeah, and you would like to think that somebody who's in his early 30s doesn't quite have the experience to know that at that time, because. And I want to be fair, he was the boss, not necessarily because he came up through the ranks, but he was the boss because he had the money to write the checks. And so once your checkbook balance doesn't always equate with your business acumen. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like he had a lot of business acumen, in trying to differentiate the Toros from the Maple Leafs, of having a lower ticket price. I mean, I was surprised, I guess not too surprised back then, to see that the Maple Leafs were one of the most expensive tickets in the league. That's certainly true today.
Yes.
For different reasons. But he was not trying to out Maple Leaf the Maple Leafs, which seems like smart business. If you're going to start a coffee business to compete against Starbucks, you don't want it to just be the same, but a little bit better. You've got to be different. And some companies do that, or they try.
And that is the one thing that he was very good at, was reading the marketplace. The Maple Leafs, I think it's well over 50 years now since their last Stanley Cup championship. I think it was 1967. I was born in Florida. I didn't know anything about hockey until I moved up north. But that price that they had to pay, the fans had to pay to get into Maple Leaf Garden. Maple Leaf Garden was a palace, so there was a certain amount of decorum that one had to follow when they went to Maple Leaf Gardens. It was expected that men would wear, ties and hats. Women would wear dresses. We think of that today when we're going to games in our flip flops and sweatshirts. That would have been frowned upon. And Bassett thought that that was their style. It works for them. But he was convinced that there was a significant population in Toronto who would want a more family-friendly environment, one where loud rock and roll music would blare during breaks in the game, one where scantily clad cheerleaders, which a winter sport in Toronto, scantily clad cheerleaders, doesn't seem like the most progressive thing to do now, but thought that having those cheerleaders out there would benefit. Inviting fans onto the ice during morning skates with the players. And it did work. The one thing that cost Bassett wasn't that he wasn't attracting fans. He got 10, 12, 13, 14,000 people to come see this other team. So he's right. But he's not a very good politician. There is no other arena in Toronto that could really house a major league hockey team other than Maple Leaf Gardens. And so he's having to pay any money he makes through ticket sales is actually going right into the Maple Leafs pockets because they're the ones that own Maple Leaf Gardens. So that after 3 years, that just couldn't work anymore. So he moved his team to Birmingham, Alabama, notorious hotbed of hockey, but he makes it work there because he studied all of America and he realized Birmingham, Alabama has a major civic rivalry with Atlanta. Atlanta's got hockey and basketball, football, baseball. Birmingham has nothing. So if I bring a major professional sports franchise to Birmingham, that's going to really sell well. And it did. Birmingham was so happy to have a major professional sports team to show Big Brother Atlanta, hey, we're big time too now.
But it sounds like he was trying to make it a little bit like football on ice in terms of like a really physical. If you don't appreciate the finer points of the game, you can go to a hockey game and watch people hit each other hard.
It was he studied the playbook of Paul Bear Bryant, the great football coach, and realized that everybody in Alabama just loved the hitting and the defense. And so that's what he did. He to use the parlance of the time, he stocked his roster full of goons and enforcers. If they scored, that was a happy accident. And what they did was they physically intimidated the opponent into missing a lot of shots, and they won through attrition. And they were very popular in Alabama, but it was his inability to be very political again that cost him. He signed a lot of players in the Canadian juniors. He emancipated the Canadian juniors. These players who were 16, 17 years old are being forced to sign contracts where, in 10 years, they'll go play for the Maple Leafs, but they have to work in this very low-paid minor league system.
Because there were age minimums like you might see today in the NFL or the NBA.
And so he said, you know what, a 17-year-old can, an 18-year-old can get drafted by the military. Why can't he be drafted by a hockey team? And so since the WHA didn't have any kind of agreement, he just started signing all of these players. And the one he could not afford to sign, Wayne Gretzky, he helped get into the World Hockey Association. And so these signings so angered the NHL that when the two sides finally did agree to a merger, one of their successful teams, the Birmingham Bulls, are left out. And that's, I know that there's a language, that was just a major FU to Bassett. That we'll take these other teams, but you have to stay behind.
So there are some mistakes there. And it seems like one of the running themes with these different leagues is, kind of overpaying for players, going beyond budgets or salary caps. That was happening in the WFL. And it sounds like that was a lesson that the USFL in the early 80s. Fair to say they didn't learn that lesson from the World Football League, WFL.
Well, Bassett did. That was another mistake of Bassett's. He felt that he had to show off. And so, I mean, they were astute signings because Toronto Toros was a playoff team. Birmingham was a playoff team. The Toronto Northmen / Memphis Southmen, his World Football League team, he convinced Larry Zonka, Paul Warfield, and Jim Kick to abandon the Miami Dolphins Super Bowl team and come play for him because he paid them millions of dollars. So he believed in the star system in the beginning. But what he discovered once again is if I have all of the stars, but none of the other teams do, the league won't last very long. And so when he goes into the United States Football League, roughly 10 years after the World Football League folds, he is a disciple of fiscal conservancy. He says we have to have a salary cap. We're not going to spend more than this amount of money for players. The only players that any team should sign should be the college players from their geographic area. Now, that was a little, clever on his part because he was in Florida at the time, and this was at the time when Florida State, and Miami were starting to churn out wonderful football players.
The idea was that fans, there would be marketing appeal, come watch players you're familiar with.
Correct. He hires an unknown football coach by the name of Steve Spurrier to be his head coach because Spurrier had won a Heisman Trophy at the University of Florida. So he packs the stadium using that method. That very low-cost method still is getting 55, 60,000 people to come see an alternate professional football league that plays in the spring. Yeah. And you and I are old enough to remember the USFL during its time, but we've also been old enough to remember the NFL Europe, the World League of American Football, 2 XFLs, the AAAF. None of them were attracting 55,000 people to the games.
Yeah. And I do remember, so, part of the differentiation coming back to that point is that the USFL was playing in the spring. And I having grown up in Michigan, I went to, I know, at least one Michigan Panthers game. They won the championship that first season, which was, somebody who was really into sports. That was exciting. Their star receiver was Anthony Carter from the University of Michigan. So I didn't know the history of trying to have the regional, players, but they seem to have a good thing going. And then, ended up folding a few years later. And I'll try to keep the conversation on the side of Donald Trump, the businessman. There was he ended up buying the New Jersey Generals, and he was the driving force behind kind of trying to move the seasons to the fall to more directly compete with the NFL, right? Was that sort of the key decision that was a big mistake?
Correct. And I think it's always wise to keep, any discussion of Trump and Bassett in the realm of just football and business in the 1980s. Donald Trump came into the USFL and was actually considered to be a savior a little bit because the first owner of the New Jersey Generals, a very nice gentleman, his name was J. Walter Duncan. He was an Oklahoma oil man and just seemed to be just a friendly guy, but was not much of a football owner. And so there's this danger of the USFL losing its franchise in the media market of the world. So when Donald Trump comes in and buys the Generals, he's hailed as a hero. And I think rightly so in the beginning because he established a presence. He knew how to get the Generals. He knew how to equally get himself on the front page and the Generals on the front of the sports page at the same time. So he was very good with the publicity. But I don't know that he came into the USFL honest about his ultimate intentions. He had been frustrated in his attempts to purchase an NFL team. And so I don't know that he was genuine as an owner. And he gets into the USFL and he immediately starts saying we should go to the fall and compete head to head with the NFL, because his whole desire, his whole plan, which has come out in multiple books, my own and other excellent books like Paul Reith's book on the history of the USFL, was to injure the NFL enough that it would force 2 or 3 USFL teams to go in, the same way the American Basketball Association had a handful of teams go in. The WHA had a number of teams go in. He didn't care if Michigan, Tampa Bay, Oakland went away, as long as his generals got into the NFL. That was what was important to him. And Bassett realized that. Bassett realized right away. It's like, and Bassett was one of his biggest buddies in the beginning, because Bassett thought he found a kindred spirit. And I always have to walk that fine line with Mr. Bassett's family when I say, well, I don't know, I think Donald and John had a lot in common. Maybe the level of honesty is different, but they had a lot in common. But once he realizes, I think this guy's just trying to work his way into the NFL and has no care for the league as a whole, that's when they became 2 of the most famous combatants in sports in the 1980s.
Well, I mean, it was probably, if it had worked, it would have been a cheaper way to get into the NFL, leveraging this lower cost New Jersey Generals team to try, to follow that track record, like you said, in other leagues, including the ABA and the NBA. Like, this had happened a lot. So it wasn't an original idea. It just didn't pan out that way with the antitrust suit and the famous $1 settlement against the NFL. But when you talk about that relationship souring between Trump, I'm going to just read a sentence from the book here. Where you wrote, Bassett sent a letter. When you talk about he didn't like bad mouthing the league. Bassett sent a letter to the New Jersey owner warning the New Yorker he would be punched in the mouth the next time he insulted Bassett or other USFL personnel. Did you get, I imagine at some point you got to read the entire letter? I don't think it was reprinted in full in the book, right?
No, I did not reprint it in full. Jeff Pearlman actually found that, the sports writer. He wrote another history of the USFL a couple of years ago. I think it was called Football for a Buck. And he found that letter in his research. I worked extensively with the Bassett family, and they had not known of that letter until Mr. Pearlman found it. And it was on, it was impeachable evidence. It's on old Tampa Bay Bandit letterhead. And it just says, if you continue to badmouth my employees, if you continue to badmouth the league, I will have no compunction in punching you in the nose. And what I loved was, because Canadians do have the stereotype of being exceedingly polite, after threatening to punch him in the nose, he signs it, cordially yours, Johnny F. Bassett.
And I think there was a bit of a Freudian slip there. That letter was unimpeachable evidence of a letter sent to a impeached. Couldn't resist that. So you mentioned Wayne Gretzky, and looking at the footnotes and and the research, the original research that you did. Tell me about the phone call with Wayne Gretzky, because I would have been really nervous. Or did you have any jitters or make any mistakes in talking to the great one?
I had jitters all the time during the writing of this. I criticized Bassett a little bit for being a fanboy when he went behind the back of his coach to let the players off the hook for fines. But a lot of what I write is because I was interested in this as a child, and I wanted to know more about it as an adult. Because when you're a child watching sports, you don't realize how complex and complicated they are. The older we get, we start to appreciate the nuance. And so when I reached out to start writing this book, I wanted to talk to Zonka, Warfield. I wanted to talk to Gretzky. And so, before my scheduled phone calls with them, I was, almost like Stuart Smiley sitting there looking in the mirror going, gosh darn it, I deserve to talk to them. They've got things to say and they'll really like me. And so I went through, did my interviews. And the one thing I never requested, I never asked for any special favors. The only signature I needed was on the release. I didn't, say, hey, can I mail you a hockey card
Right.
to sign? Or, hey, my nephew Mark is a really big hockey fan. Would you leave a voicemail for him? Because that's not a professional thing to do. But in the back of my head, I was thinking about that a lot.
I mean, you don't want to be like the Chris Farley character on Saturday Night Live, who was all nervous and flustered trying to interview Paul McCartney.
Yeah. Hey, you remember that time when you were like going to LA from Edmonton? So, but no, it was very nice. I won't talk about people who are not particularly friendly. One of the things I do enjoy is when a star of Gretzky's caliber ends up being nicer than you could possibly imagine. Or
cool.
Larry Zonka, who comes across so gruff and surly sometimes.
Tough, yeah.
Was just such a teddy bear when he was talking about Mr. Bassett. He just, he didn't have a long time in the WFL, but he adored the man. And so that's always the nice part of this, job.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit before we wrap up. You had this interesting timing and opportunity to talk about something I learned from you when we had talked maybe a month or so ago, a new version of the USFL. I didn't realize this was coming. Tell us a little bit about that. And I'm going to ask you to make a prediction. Will they be able to avoid repeating the mistakes of USFL 1?
Well, I think they will. It does seem a little odd to me that this new spring league is just rebranding themselves. From my understanding, because there's not a lot of reading material out there yet that's concrete. They have started hiring some coaches. I believe Jeff Fisher is going to be one of the coaches.
Yeah.
But all 8 teams are going to be based in Birmingham, Alabama. So there is a Michigan Panther from your home. Yeah. And there's a Tampa Bay Bandit from my home, but neither team are ever going to play in Michigan or Florida, respectively. It's all going to be in Birmingham.
Yeah. I sorry to interrupt. I did read something earlier today that they say eventually the idea is that the teams will go to their proper homes, but who knows if it lasts that long.
Yeah, I mean, but the last 2 leagues that have tried never made it past the halfway point of their respective seasons. The second version of the XFL and the AAF, I attributed it to the fact that, you and I could go out and buy a couple of guitars and call ourselves the Beatles, but that doesn't make us the Beatles. And so
it would be a lot more expensive to buy the name of the Beatles than the USFL name was probably cheap, whoever still owned that.
Yeah, this is true. But for those of us of a certain age, I guess seeing the Lone Horseman logo will be a nice treat, but it's going to be very hollow, in a way, because that's not Gary Anderson, John Reeves, or Chuck Hitchcock out there on the field. It was a wonderful 3 years, but it had its time and it had its opportunity, and now it's gone. And I don't know that you can recreate that in any way.
Yeah. I mean, this is a different crystal ball. Do you think the USFL would have survived if it had remained a spring league?
I don't know if it's still around today, but I do think eventually people like Bassett, people like Alfred Taubman, people like Miles Tannenbaum of the Philadelphia Stars, which was a good team. There were enough solid owners in there that had they stayed in the spring, they would have worked out some kind of detente with the NFL, because about 4 years after the demise, 4 or 5 years after the demise of the USFL, we get the World League of American Football, which was spring football, but minor league football for the NFL. And I don't know if Bassett, I think Bassett became more circumspect. Maybe he wouldn't have liked being referred to as a minor league owner, but I think if it meant keeping his Bandits alive, he would have been happy to be feeding players into the NFL as long as he could still run his franchise his way.
Yeah. There was one mistake you wrote about going back to the start of the USFL. that Bassett tried warning the other owners about. They were going to skip preseason games. And it's just the first games, they wanted to have a big splash. First games would be televised, real games, not having the fans being upset about paying the old, the still current NFL practice of paying full price for a preseason game that doesn't mean anything. And Bassett warned them. And it sounded like there was sloppy play, low scoring games. People didn't like that. If I'm remembering right, the XFL made that exact same mistake.
Yeah, all of the leagues have. I think they have some controlled scrimmages. I think the AAF and the recent version of the XFL had controlled scrimmages, which is what Bassett actually did, but put them on television because that's Johnny Bassett. But it's one of those things. I know we still have the huge thing now with the NFL going eventually to 18 games, which I love football, but my goodness, that's just a lot of football. There's talk about maybe getting rid of preseason games altogether. And I don't know that, the fans complain about the price of admission, and rightly so. I do think in a perfect world, the NFL owners would just allow people to come into the stadiums for free and just pay for the beer and the parking for these practice, let people who don't normally get to see NFL games come in to see an NFL game. And we can laugh about, Tom Brady doesn't need preseason. Well, but the fifth round draft pick from Northwestern, who's desperately trying to make a roster as a cornerback, he could use those preseason games. Yeah,
for sure. And there's benefit, but I can see from a fan standpoint, the value isn't necessarily there. So there's the business issues of these sports leagues that, like, I think as you were maybe alluding to, as kids, we didn't really have any visibility to. I thought the Michigan Panthers were, had a pretty cool logo. I had a Michigan Panthers t-shirt. The USFL had some big name players. I mean, there was something there. So it's a shame it didn't work out. Final question for you, Denis. There are some startup leagues from the last couple of decades that have avoided some of this fate of Johnny Bassett's leagues, and that it's not like, again, the failures were his fault. He didn't own the league, he owned a team. But MLS, Major League Soccer, WNBA, I mean, there's different dynamics, but like, what are your thoughts on some of these leagues that have survived, if not even thrived a little bit, things they've done differently, mistakes they've avoided?
Well, I do enjoy the WNBA in that it does help. They have a lifeline. They have a safety net in the NBA. But they have not been afraid of allowing themselves to expand and contract and expand and just follow the business. Nobody has overreacted. And I think that's been another strength of MLS. I do not proclaim myself much of a professional soccer fan. I was when I was a boy, when we had the Tampa Bay Rowdies in the old North American Soccer League, but I haven't fallen back in love with that sport because it went away for such a long time. But once again, the MLS has done a very good job of not overreacting when the market went down. They've ridden out the storms, and they've figured out who they are, and they figured out where their best markets are. And I think that's one of the things I enjoy, that you don't necessarily have to have a powerhouse in New York. If your powerhouse is the Portland Timbers, you're still going to have a strong league because people want to see talent. Television wants to see all of the talent in New York, but you and I as fans, if the best basketball player in the world is playing for Sacramento, we will figure out a way to watch the King games. Yeah.
Time zones being the biggest challenge then for that. But and I think just maybe one other thought, and one league that has failed and it was a lot of fun to go to was arena football. Now I know the concept still exists, but the original, that AFL, the Arena Football League, for what it's worth, just my lament that didn't survive. I'll probably never get to go to a Super Bowl. I did get to go to an Arena Bowl championship game in
the Detroit
Phoenix.
Drive.
Well, they won some championships, but I went to a Arizona Rattlers championship bowl in Phoenix. So, it's a tough business. It seems, these sports leagues. You look at the major established leagues, and you think they have a license to print money, and I can see why that would attract competitors. Easier said than done to make a success out of it.
And I could be wrong. This is the thing when impromptu conversations. Sometimes what I'm thinking may not be completely factual, but my understanding with the Arena League is they expanded too quickly. They kind of made the mistake the United States Football League did. They expanded too quickly, and then when they had to start contracting franchises, even the owners of successful franchises started to panic and maybe not put as much money into it as they did. I think they ended up, their final season, did they just have 4 teams? I think
it had really crumbled. Yeah, it was a shell of the former league. But again, I think it's fun exploring these things, not because any of us are going to own a sports team, but I think there are general business lessons. That one, especially, of be careful that you don't grow too fast, because there are many profitable businesses that end up not having cash flow and they fail. So lots of lessons to be drawn from sports, and more specifically from what you've documented here, Denis, the life and teams of Johnny F. Bassett, Maverick entrepreneur of North American sports. We've been joined today by Denis Crawford. Not cover up your name on the title that I'm holding up. Denis Crawford, you can find it on Amazon. It's if you're a sports fan and or a business entrepreneur book reader, it's a fun overlap of those two genres. So Denis, I want to thank you. I want to thank the cat who made an appearance over your shoulder for those who are watching on YouTube.
And Chuck is now an international superstar.
Well, Chuck was, those who were listening on the podcast feed would have never known. So give Chuck a little extra cat food or something as a thanks. But Denis, thank you for being here as a guest today. It's been a lot of fun, really interesting book and interesting life of Johnny F. Bassett. So thank you. Thank you again.
Oh, thank you for the invite.